Hello friend, thanks for joining me for my 2022 reading year wrap-up video. So yeah, I had a great reading year for 2022. Here is the list of books that I read in the order that I read them. I read a total of 46 books, both fiction and nonfiction, across multiple genres, as well as poetry. This is the way I read. I'm a really eclectic reader, and I don't stick to any one genre for very long. I pretty much jump around in my reading, and that's the way I like to keep it going. Yeah, so 46 books, they were all different sort of sizes, so I didn't select the books based on how many books I could get read in any given year. Some of them were big door stoppers and others were fairly brief. So it just depended on the book, because the book is really what it's all about. That's what's keeping me interested and keeps me reading, right? So yeah, the way I typically choose my books, I keep a prioritized reading list. I'm pretty structured in my reading. I keep a prioritized reading list that I want to get to. For example, I'm already working on 2023s, and these will be the books that I kind of want to prioritize getting read in 2023. And then I'll have a group of others on a want to read list that keeps them on my radar. And that way, whenever I'm going to select my next book, I'm really a just-in-time kind of book purchaser. I purchase the book I'm about to read right before I start reading it. So I plan my reading, is what I'm saying, a bit in advance. But let's jump into it. I thought it'd be kind of fun to go through this list. I break it down by fiction, nonfiction, as well as poetry. And then the fiction, I'm going to divide by genre, and also the nonfiction. And then I'll also look at when the publication year of each of the books were, sort of just to get a look at what I'm reading as far as current books versus older books. So I like to keep an eye on that as well. So let's just jump into it. Okay, so here are the works of fiction that I read in 2022. I kicked off my fiction reading year by reading The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. This is book 2 of the Wheel of Time fantasy series. I had read book 1 at the end of 2021, and I had a reading goal for 2022 of getting through the first 6 of the series in 2022, so reading 5 of the fantasy books in 2022, which I was actually able to do. So this was book 2 of the series. Then I read Nightmare Alley by William Lindsay Gresham. This book is a work of noir fiction. I was really interested in this because there was a movie adaptation of this book last year, and so I really wanted to read the book itself, and it was quite a different experience, and I enjoyed it a lot. Then I read Strange Life of Ivan Osokin by P.D. Ouspensky. I'd been hearing about this book, had been popping up in other books as reference for quite some time. This is one of those books. It's a philosophical book around that idea of the eternal kind of recurrence where you're living your same life over and over again. Like, for example, if you were able to go back at the beginning of your life and live, with your current consciousness, most people think they would make different choices, but this book explores that idea that actually we wouldn't. We would actually make the same choices over and over again. Then I read Middlemarch by George Eliot. This was a reread for me. I love this book. It's one of my favorite books, definitely one of my favorite books of the 19th century, and I wanted to reread this, so I got this reread in 2022. Then I read Apartment by Teddy Wayne. This book really was a gut punch. It had a real emotional kick to it, especially there at the end about a young man, friendship with another young man, and just a lot of stuff there, and I really did get a lot from that, although, like I said, it did pack a punch. Then The Dragon Reborn. This is book 3 of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. I'm working my way through that fantasy series. I'm buddy reading this actually with a coworker, Aneth. We're buddy reading this series slowly. Hope to get through another 5 of the books in 2023, which will take me up to, I think, book 11. So I would be almost finished with the series after 2023. That's the current plan anyway. Then I read Dear Edward by Anne Napolitano. I had heard about this, and it had been on my radar for a year or so, and I decided to go ahead and get this read about a young boy who is the only survivor of a plane crash and the implications of that. Really a good read there, too. Then I read Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands by Jorge Amado. This is a Brazilian novel from the 1960s. So good. It's got a movie adaptation that's also highly entertaining, but Dona Flor marries just like the worst husband ever who dies, and then she marries a man who's the complete opposite of her first husband, but the two husbands then sort of still interact in her life, and so it's really a fun and just an enjoyable read it was. Then I decided to turn my attention to some Haruki Murakami. I reread Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. I had originally planned for 2022 to read Dance, Dance, Dance by Haruki Murakami, a book I had never read by him, but instead I decided to reread Hard-Boiled Wonderland. I have read this already previously a couple of other times. It's probably still my favorite of the Murakami novels, and again, it did not disappoint. So Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar was the next work of fiction that I read. This is a memoir. It's a fictionalized memoir of the Emperor Hadrian of the Roman Empire. And this was just so good. It's such a meditative look back on Hadrian as an old man at this point in the memoir, looking back on his life and career and his relationship with Antoninus. So it's just a really beautiful, and it really reads like a real memoir. So that was really enjoyable. Then I picked up Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, another book that I've read in the past, so this was a reread for me, but it's one of my favorite of the Dickens novels, and I just wanted to, I had never chatted it on my channel, so I wanted to read it again so that I could give it a really good chat here on my channel, so I did, and I enjoyed that a lot as well. Then I read book 4 of the Wheel of Time series called The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. You know, again, I love this series. The Wheel of Time series has a gendered kind of use of magic that's just fascinating to me, and I like the way that it's done in the series. So I just enjoy this series so much. So then I decided to read The High Window by Raymond Chandler, some hard-boiled detective fiction. Just Raymond Chandler, sort of a classic master of this sort of art, and this one I enjoyed a lot. Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov was my next read, a work of science fiction, and it is also the Foundation series. I am going to try to get through 2 of the additional Foundation series novels next year. This was a reread for me. I had read this one like a long time ago, I believe, but from here on out, the Foundation novels I have not read, so those will be new, but I'll have some more Isaac Asimov coming up in 2023. Then I read Gertrude by Hermann Hesse. So I've been over the last few years, I've been working my way through the Hesse novels, and I'm almost done with them. I have a couple more of the novels to go, and so I'm going to try to get through both of those remaining novels in 2023. So I'll have some more Hermann Hesse coming up. This was about a young man's sort of doomed relationship with a young woman, Gertrude, and it was really enjoyable, kind of classic Hesse here. Then I read some historical fiction, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This is the first in a trilogy set in the Henry VIII Tudor era, all around Anne Boleyn, when Henry VIII is trying to divorce his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn, and the central character here is Thomas Cromwell, the king's sort of fixer, trying to make that happen. Then I read A Man in Full by Tom Wolfe. I had actually read this years ago, so this was another book that was a reread for me, but again, I had never chatted it on my channel, and I wanted to read it again so that I could chat it. It is about, the reason why I like it so much is because it's got a Stoic philosophy connection. One of the characters, a young man who winds up in prison, finds Stoic philosophy that ends up being the guidepost then for his life, and so to me that's the best part of the book. But it takes a look at this Atlanta of the late 1990s and just sort of a social commentary like Tom Wolfe was so famous for doing. Then I read Querelle of Brest by Jean Genet. This book I had read a couple of years ago. I had read Our Lady of the Flowers by Jean Genet, so I wanted to read something else by him. And this one was, I had also seen this. This has been adapted into a very kind of strange movie called Querelle. And I wanted to read the book to see what the book was compared to the movie, because I wasn't quite sure that I got the movie entirely. I definitely understand it better, but Querelle is a young sailor who's also a serial killer and criminal, and yeah, sort of plying the back alleys of Brest in France. And so it was really a good read as well. Then I read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I had read this years and years ago, but I wanted to reread it again because I had never chatted any works actually by Jane Austen on my channel. So I wanted to give this one a reread and get a chat on it here on my channel. So I did that. Loved it. You know, love every movie adaptation that's ever been done for this book practically. So it's the story never disappoints me, and I always enjoy going back and revisiting the Bennet family. So then I read The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan. This is book 5 of the Wheel of Time series, fantasy series that I've been working my way through. Again, not disappointing. You know, the thing about this series is the books, they pick up basically where the last one left off, so you do kind of need to read them in order, but they're really page turners, especially usually the way his pacing is by the time you get to about half or 3/4 of the way into the book, it's just like nonstop plot twists and action. So, you know, they're always fun to read. Then I read Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. This is another work of historical fiction. This is all about John Wilkes Booth, the Booth family, not just John Wilkes Booth, the assassinator of President Lincoln, but really his family and how they all grew up together and sort of how he wound up where he was in history. Really interesting to me. I enjoyed it a lot. The Booth family had been popping up into some other things that I had read over the last couple of years, and so I was kind of interested to get this historical fiction take on John Wilkes Booth, and that was a lot of fun. Then I read Perhaps the Stars by Ada Palmer. This is a 4th volume of a quartet, a science fiction quartet. Not an easy read necessarily. I would like to reread this whole quartet again because the way that the books came out, there was a delay, you know, of several years between the books, and so the world building here is just so fantastic, set in the future where there are no more nation states. So that alone is a wonderful sort of thought food to take into consideration what our world would look like without nation states, and then if the world were to go to war, what would war look like without nation states? So that's just I enjoyed this entire series. So Perhaps the Stars was the 4th and final volume of that quartet. Then I read White Noise by Don DeLillo. This had been on my reading list for quite some time, and then I heard that there was a movie adaptation coming up, and I was like, wait, I have that on my want-to-read list. Let me go ahead and pull that one and read that before the movie comes out. And I have yet to see the movie adaptation of it, but I did enjoy the book. It's sort of unusual, all about this professor of Hitler studies. This is definitely a social commentary type novel. Postmodern, definitely look at our society, U.S. society, consumer society. Anyway, there's a lot that happens here. Then I read The Spectator Bird by Wallace Stegner. This is sort of a man in retirement, early retirement, who's reflecting on an event that happened earlier in his life along with his wife. And so to me, I think that's what appealed to it, is this sort of retired man, not an elderly man yet, but later middle age, sort of looking back on his life. And it's just really well written, and I enjoyed that a lot. Then I turned my attention to some more hard-boiled detective fiction, The Dane Curse by Dashiell Hammett. I have been reading my way through the Hammett and the Chandler novels that I mentioned earlier, and so The Dane Curse I wanted to get to, and, you know, again, it did not disappoint. There's one more of the Dashiell Hammett novels that I wanted to get to this year, which I'll talk about here in a bit. But then I read The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham. I read a couple of his other works over the last couple of years and chatted them here on my channel. And so I wanted to get another work by Maugham in 2022, and I had selected The Moon and Sixpence. This is all about the story of an artist, a middle-aged artist, who just up and decides to leave his wife and children, never to see them again. It cuts them off completely to pursue a life of art in France, and it's sort of loosely patterned after the life of Paul Gauguin, the artist, the real-life artist, but it's not actually a biography of him. It's definitely a fictionalized account, but nevertheless, a very unlikable main character, but a very enjoyable read. Then I read Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. This is another one I had on my want to read list, but I wasn't really prioritizing reading it until I decided to join this book club here in my building, and they had selected it as their work of fiction, and I decided, well, it's on my want to read list anyway. I will give that a read, and then I forgot to go to the book club meeting. So, but I did love this book. It was one of my favorite, probably one of my favorite reads of the year, probably. Then I read Lord of Chaos by Robert Jordan, book 6 of the Wheel of Time series. Yeah, with my coworker Anna, we have a great time sort of buddy reading this series. And this series, we're still making our way through. There's still a lot of books to go. I think there are 14 books total. But yeah, that never disappoints me. Then I read some Soviet-era Russian science fiction, Lame Fate, Ugly Swans by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. I've been reading my way through the Strugatsky brothers novels over the last few years, and I've chatted them here on my channel. And you know, the thing about these are that we didn't get good translations of these back in like the 70s or 80s, but now they're being retranslated into good English translations. And so, yeah, I love this. This was actually 2 stories. It's a nested novel, so the odd chapters are Lame Fate, and then the even chapters are Ugly Swans, and there's 2 different storylines that are tied together, but nevertheless different. So a very enjoyable read there. Also, social commentary definitely around the Soviet system of publishing, specifically with this particular book. Then I read some more Charles Dickens, David Copperfield this time. You know, I had watched the adaptation called A Personal History of David Copperfield or something like that that came out a couple of years ago. Had Dev Patel in it as David Copperfield. And I just laughed and thought it was so fun. And I had read David Copperfield probably 15 years ago. And so I decided just to read this one again and see if I would enjoy it as much as I did that movie adaptation. And I did. I loved it. Laughed out loud in several places. Then finally, I round up my fiction reading year with another Dashiell Hammett novel, The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett. This has also been adapted into a whole movie series, actually. First one being called The Thin Man. And I have wanted to read this because I wondered, first of all, I wondered how it differed from the movie adaptation. And second, I wanted to finish out the published novels of Dashiell Hammett. And I think this is the last one. I'll have to verify that. I think there's some stories, collected stories and things like that still that I haven't read. So maybe have some more Dashiell Hammett coming up in the future. Okay, so that's the general sort of the synopsis of all the books, all the fiction books. Just to recap, I read 15 what I'm classifying as literary books. Now, the way I classify things into these categories might not be the way you do or the way that a book critic would, but this is the way that I'm doing it. So I'm counting 15 of the books that I read I consider to be literary. There were 5 books that I considered to be fantasy, 4 that I consider to be detective fiction or hard-boiled or noir fiction. I read 3 books that I consider historical fiction, 3 books that I consider science fiction, 1 book that I consider philosophical fiction. Then that is it. So for the nonfiction, I read a total of 13 books in nonfiction. So let's just run through these pretty quickly. The first work of nonfiction that I read, Grant by Ron Chernow, is a biography of General Grant, later President Grant. So on my 2022 reading plan, I had a presidential biography. I had not selected the president. I knew that I wanted to read a biography of a president. And so when it came time to pick that out, I came across this one of Grant. I really wanted to read this one because it had been referenced. Grant had been referenced in another book about Shakespeare that I had read last year, I believe. And so there were some aspects of Grant's personality that were sort of intriguing to me, and I wanted to explore his life a little bit more. So I chose to read this biography and enjoyed it quite a lot. Then I read a collection of essays by Andre Aciman called Homo Irrealis. This was also really, really smart, really intelligent, a lot of French cinema that I had never seen got referenced here, but nevertheless very thoughtful here in these essays, and sort of a melancholy kind of feel to these essays. I enjoyed them a lot, though. Then I read The Cloud of Unknowing, which is actually also the oldest book that I read. I'll have more on that here in a bit. This is a work of spiritual work by an anonymous author. We do not know who the author was. This was really I love this kind of spiritual guidance type of book, and this one did not disappoint. The thing about this one, though, I thought I was getting a modern translation of it, and I didn't. I ended up getting a translation from the 17th century, so the 1600s, so it still had this pretty archaic language, so it took a bit of to get used to reading this type of language, but once I got used to it, it was okay, and I enjoyed it a lot. Then I read Dead Man Walking, a memoir by Helen Prejean. This is around the death penalty, some death penalty cases. Sister Helen is a Catholic nun, and she wrote this memoir around her work around with death row inmates and the death penalty itself. This was adapted into a movie that I saw many, many years ago in the 90s sometime. I have not seen it since. Very powerful movie, though, and the book also very powerful, and I learned a lot about the death penalty by reading Sister Helen's memoir here. Then I read 12 Caesars by Mary Beard. This is around the artwork. This is really more art history. This is around the art surrounding like the busts and the coins and the way that the Caesars, these specifically 12 particular Caesars, are presented, and how in Europe these particular 12 got selected out of all of the emperors to be depicted in this way is explained, as well as how their images have changed over time, as well as how they've been used by other states and how they've been used throughout history. Just really a fascinating look into this topic that I didn't even really know I was interested in until I came across this book, and I enjoyed this a lot. Then I read The Quest for Hermes Trismegistus by Gary Lockman. I've been reading my way through Gary Lockman's books over the last few years. I read typically like one a year. This sort of history of esoteric knowledge and European esoteric knowledge, and I just find it really interesting. Hermes Trismegistus for centuries was thought to be this very wise sort of almost magician type of character that really existed supposedly and had this wealth of very ancient and hidden knowledge. And then later we have discovered that he was not probably a real person, but nevertheless this knowledge has been passed down for centuries and used in all kinds of different ways. This book was just so fascinating to me. Then I read The Future of Man by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So this is an author. I had read another of his books last year, and I like this topic too, the Omega Man, how human consciousness is evolving and changing into something else, he argues, and how that occurs and what will happen when we do evolve into a whole different way of being, way of understanding, way of knowing, really, our very consciousness changing. So fascinating read to me. Then I read Becoming Duchess Goldblatt by Anonymous. This is anonymous writer of this memoir, true life memoir. Duchess Goldblatt is a online persona created by the author of this memoir to cope with some traumatic changes that she had in her life. This book was really inspirational. I did not really see that coming. I really chose it because of the online persona aspect. I thought that was really interesting, but how I didn't expect it to be as inspirational as it turned out to be. So that was really a good read. Then I turned my attention to Cosmic Consciousness by Richard Maurice Buck. Cosmic Consciousness is one of these books that I've seen referenced multiple times and have never read. This book actually introduced the term cosmic consciousness, if I'm not mistaken. And so this was mainly case studies around people who had these sort of shifts in consciousness to a more cosmic outlook. And so it was pretty interesting. Then I read a history of the third volume of a 3-volume history of the Third Reich. It's called The Third Reich at War by Richard J. Evans. I had read the previous 2 volumes over the last couple of years, so I had been meaning to get to the 3rd volume for quite some time and finally did. It was a difficult volume to get through, not because of the way it's written. It's actually written in a very accessible way to the general public. It's just that it's such a heavy subject matter. There's so much violence and death in World War II that is really hard to grasp. And so this is not really a history of World War II. It's a history specifically of the Third Reich itself. And so that's the difference. But it was nevertheless extremely interesting, and I learned a lot. Then I decided to read Code Girls by Liza Mundy, another book. This book I probably would not have chosen, although the book club I mentioned earlier, this was their nonfiction selection. And so I thought, well, let me go ahead and read the nonfiction selection as well because I had time. So I did read it and then forgot to go to the meeting of the book club. But nevertheless, I did enjoy the book quite more than I expected. Learned a lot about code-breaking activities in the U.S. during World War II and done largely by women that were recruited secretly at first. Just extremely interesting story about how all that happened. Then I turned my attention to World War I and read the Zimmerman Telegram by Barbara W. Tuchman. I've read some of Barbara W. Tuchman's histories in the past, but I've never read this one. But the Zimmerman Telegram, this historical event of the telegram, was mentioned in Code Girls. And so I thought, well, let me go ahead, since I wanted to get to a Barbara Tuchman book this year if possible, and I had time, I just decided to read this one. And so this is all about the Zimmerman Telegram, which happened during World War I, which ended up pulling the U.S. into World War I. The Zimmerman Telegram was a telegram from Germany to Mexico, offering Mexico, if they were to enter the war on the side of Germany, then when the war was won, Germany would give Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico in compensation. So that, of course, caused outrage in the U.S. and basically caused the U.S. finally to enter World War I in 1917. Extremely interesting. So, yeah, I'm really glad I read that. Then I wrapped up my nonfiction reading year by reading The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And this is a history of humanity, of really nation states, and how from the Neolithic era all the way through today, really, but mainly this period of time before, like, non-European people have organized themselves socially in multiple different ways. And that was really interesting to me. And I learned a lot here about how different societies, I think there's this tendency in history to think that we're on this linear trajectory, right, all the way to a complex modern nation state like we know today from some distant past, and that's really not how history has been. It's been sort of all over the place. So I learned a lot from reading that book. Okay, so that's the nonfiction. I read a total of 5 books I consider history. I read 3 books I consider philosophy or spiritual books, 2 books that are memoir, 1 art history book, 1 biography, 1 book of essays, and then finally, turning my attention to the last 2 books, are poetry. So I don't consider poetry to be either fiction or nonfiction. So I consider poetry sort of a class unto itself because it's a little bit fiction and it's a little bit nonfiction. So I read 2 collected works of poetry this year. First one, Under Capitalism, If Your Head Aches, They Just Yank Off Your Head, by Ariel Francisco. He is a contemporary poet who I have read another one of his collections, and I have another one on my list to read for 2023 as well. I love his poetry, and this one did not disappoint. And then I read Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminski, which had been on my reading radar for quite some time, so I spent some time with Deaf Republic this year, and also that did not disappoint. So that's the poetry that I read. All right, so just to recap sort of the period of time the books were published in, one thing I'm really interested in always is, how much am I reading that's current? Current meaning like released in the same year, like maybe new releases released the year like 2022, or versus books from the past. And from the books from the past, am I reading anything in particular more than others? So I like to break it down at the end of the year just to see how it has all shaken out for the year. So for this year, I read 1 book that was pre-19th century, and that's The Cloud of Unknowing, published in 1375. Then in the 19th century, I read 4 books from the 19th century. And then from the 1900s on, I read at least 1 book from every decade of the 20th century, and the 21st century. So let's just run through those pretty quick. From the 1900s, I read one book. From the 1910s, I read 3 books. From the 1920s, I read 1 book. From the 1930s, I read 1 book. From the 1940s, I read 3 books. From the 1950s, I read 4 books. From the 1960s, I read 1 book. From the 1970s, I read 1 book. From the 1980s, I read 3 books. And then from the 1990s, I read more because I've been reading that series, the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. They're all published in the 90s so far anyway. And so I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books total from the 1990s. So the 1990s, it turned out, was the second most popular decade for me to read in 2022. In the 2000s, I read 2 books. The 2010s, I read 4 books. And then finally, the 2020s, I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 books from the 2020s. From 2022, the current year, I read 2 books. So 2 new releases that I read this year. The rest were either from 2020 or 2021. All right, so I think I will leave the chat there. That is the basic wrap-up for my 2022 reading year. I have lots of stuff coming up for 2023. Like I mentioned, I'm already working on my reading plan for 2023, so I will have more coming, so stay tuned. Whether you decide to read 1 book or 50 books or 100 books in 2023, I hope that you find one that really just takes you to a new time or place or a place of understanding. That's my hope for everybody in 2023. Until next time, take care.